That's the kind of argument I'd expect from a first-year law student. With those words, Federal Judge William Alsup leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. The crowded courtroom in Washington, D.C. fell into a stunned silence. A sitting member of Congress, Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, had just been publicly dismissed by one of the most senior figures on the federal bench. For a moment, it seemed as if Alsup, 78 years old, silver-haired, and feared for his cutting remarks, had once again put a younger attorney in her place. But what followed would leave reporters scrambling for notes, lawyers whispering among themselves, and the legal community debating whether this exchange would redefine the limits of judicial authority in America. A courtroom on edge. The hearing that morning was no routine session. It concerned a voting rights case widely described by civil rights advocates as the most consequential in a generation. At issue, whether new restrictions passed in several states would stand, potentially reshaping access to the ballot for millions of Americans, particularly in minority communities. The ornate federal courthouse, its wood-paneled walls and high ceilings echoing with tension, was filled to capacity. Journalists filled the back rows, their pens poised, aware that the outcome could directly shape the next election. Presiding over the case was Judge William Alsup, appointed to the bench in 1999 by President Bill Clinton. Over the years, he had earned a reputation for sharp intellect and even sharper retorts. His habit of smirking when dismissing arguments earned him the nickname the Smirking Judge. Once considered a balanced voice, observers had begun to note his growing skepticism toward progressive legal claims, especially those brought by women and attorneys of color. Enter Jasmine Crockett. Facing Alsup that day was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 42, representing Texas's 30th District. Though relatively new to Capitol Hill, Crockett was no stranger to legal battles. Before entering politics, she built her name as a civil rights attorney and public defender in Texas, with more than 100 trials to her credit. Her courtroom tenacity earned her the nickname the Giant Slayer, a nod to her success in challenging powerful adversaries. Crockett wasn't in court as a casual observer. She had filed an amicus brief in the case and been granted time to argue. As a member of both the House Judiciary Committee and the Congressional Black Caucus, she carried the weight of her community and her party's interest in protecting voting access. For her, this wasn't just legal theory. It was a fight with real consequences for millions of voters. A pattern of dismissal. The confrontation didn't happen in a vacuum. On the previous day, during preliminary arguments, observers noted that Judge Alsup had frequently cut off female attorneys while allowing their male counterparts more leeway. When Crockett's team presented data showing widespread voter disenfranchisement, the judge audibly sighed and muttered what reporters nearby interpreted as typical exaggeration. The remark, though brief, underscored what many civil rights advocates had long feared, that arguments for expanded voting access were being treated with impatience, if not outright disdain. Why it matters. This clash was about more than courtroom theatrics. If Judge Alsup ultimately upheld the voting restrictions, millions could face new barriers in casting their ballots. To many, the stakes were nothing less than the future of American democracy. Crockett's decision to confront him directly put her in the spotlight, but it also turned the hearing into a symbolic battle over respect, representation, and the boundaries of judicial power. A moment that demands reflection. As Crockett steadied her legal pad and locked eyes with the judge, the room seemed to hold its breath. Was this to be another moment of judicial dominance, or the start of a reckoning for unchecked courtroom arrogance? The answer would come in the minutes that followed, but even before that, one thing was clear. This was no ordinary hearing. It was a test of whether a new generation of leaders would bow to the weight of old institutions or stand their ground. Congresswoman, this is my courtroom. I've been interpreting constitutional law since before you passed the bar. Judge William Allup's voice echoed through the chamber, his trademark smirk widening as he leaned forward. The challenge was unmistakable. The courtroom froze. Every pen paused mid-scribble, every eye locked on the duel unfolding between the veteran judge and the freshman lawmaker. A confrontation. Long in the making, rumours had already circulated that Alsup resented giving a congresswoman, especially a newly elected one, time to speak in his courtroom. Insiders whispered he had only granted Jasmine Crockett'S request after strong encouragement from higher judicial authorities. His body language confirmed the tension. As she approached the podium that morning, Alsup barely glanced up from his papers, projecting an air of dismissal that rippled across the packed gallery. But Crockett was not easily rattled. With years of experience as a public defender in Texas, she had faced biased judges and entrenched racism in courtrooms far less welcoming than this one. Today, she stood not only as a lawyer, but also as an elected representative, carrying the weight of her district and the voices of voters who feared being silenced. Setting the stage. Crockett's opening words were measured but firm. Before I address the legal merits of this case, I would like to express my concern about your characterization of our arguments yesterday. The remark pierced the air. Alsup quickly cut her off. If you have actual arguments to present, I suggest you get to them without the lecture. It was a stark reminder of the unequal power dynamic. The judge towering over the attorney, his authority shaping every move in the courtroom. But Crockett did not flinch. With all due respect, Your Honour, I passed the bar after studying the same constitution you did. That document does not change based on how long one has been interpreting it. The audience stirred. Murmurs rippled through the chamber as Allup's smirk faltered for the first time. Evidence meets resistance. Determined, Crockett shifted to her core argument, that the voting restrictions under review would disproportionately harm minority communities, rural voters, and the elderly. Opening her folder, she requested to present the statistical evidence that had been interrupted during the previous day's proceedings. Alsup granted permission with a dismissive wave. Statistics can be manipulated to support any position, he added dryly. The civil rights attorneys in attendance exchanged visible looks of frustration. Unfazed, Crockett pressed on, guiding the judge to specific pages of her brief. When Alsup interrupted again, claiming her numbers overlooked alternative voting methods, she countered smoothly. Actually, Your Honour, if you'll look at page 17, you'll see our analysis of every voting method affected by these restrictions. Her readiness caught him off guard. Alsup frowned, rifling through the documents before him. His irritation was evident. Turning to the core question. At last, the judge challenged her directly. What about the state's interest in preventing fraud? Crockett had anticipated the question. She pointed to Exhibit C, a chart documenting confirmed cases of voter fraud over the past 2 decades. Fewer than 30 across millions of ballots cast. These isolated incidents do not justify laws that would obstruct hundreds of thousands of legitimate voters, she argued, her voice steady but forceful. For the first time that morning, the power in the room seemed to shift. What had begun as a dismissive exchange was transforming into a full-scale battle of evidence versus authority, determination versus skepticism. The larger stakes. The confrontation went beyond 2 individuals trading barbs. To many in the room, it symbolized a larger clash in American democracy, where the courts would treat arguments for voting access with the seriousness they deserved, or dismiss them as exaggerated political rhetoric. Crockett's insistence on grounding her arguments in data, despite constant interruptions, underscored her reputation as the giant slayer. And in that moment, her calm persistence began to pierce even the formidable shield of Judge Allup's courtroom dominance. The judiciary has a duty to scrutinize laws that threaten constitutional rights, not simply defer to legislatures. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett'S words cut through the silence of the federal courtroom like a blade. Across the bench, Judge William Alsup shifted in his chair, his earlier composure beginning to fray. Clash over judicial duty. Alsup countered quickly. The legislature, he argued, had an obligation to prevent fraud, and the court should recognize that proactive role. Crockett, calm but resolute, pressed back. While lawmakers might claim to safeguard elections, it was the judiciary's responsibility to guard against overreach that trampled constitutional protections. The tension grew sharper as she invoked Harper vs. Virginia Board of Elections, the 1966 Supreme Court decision that struck down poll taxes. Alsup dismissed the comparison. That case, he insisted, was about fees, while today's debate was about verification procedures. But Crockett did not yield. Procedures that force citizens to pay for documents or travel long distances impose the same kind of financial barrier, she replied. The effect is identical, even if the mechanism is different. Court reporters scribbled furiously, aware that this was no longer just an exchange of legal citations. It was turning into a defining moment, an open challenge to how voting rights are weighed against claims of fraud prevention. The question of bias. Frustrated, Alsup tried to undercut Crockett's approach. This court needs legal arguments, not emotional appeals about voting rights, he declared. The dismissal drew sharp reactions from the audience. Crockett paused, her expression unreadable. Then, breaking the tension, she smiled. Your Honour, I find it interesting that when male attorneys make constitutional arguments about the Second Amendment or corporate speech, they're praised as scholarly. But when a black woman presents constitutional arguments about voting rights, the foundation of our democracy, they're brushed aside as emotional. The room erupted with gasps. No one had ever spoken to Judge Alsup in such stark terms. His smirk was gone, replaced by a glare. I would advise you to be very careful about questioning this court's impartiality, he warned. Unmoved, Crockett clarified, I am not questioning impartiality. I am pointing out a pattern. And since we are discussing the nature of arguments in this courtroom, let me add something further. Confronting the judge with his own words. At her signal, an aide handed her a transcript. Crockett read aloud Alsup's remarks from the landmark Shelby County versus Holder case, where he had once said, "Times have changed, and the extraordinary measures once necessary may no longer be needed." She lifted her gaze. Yet the evidence today shows voter suppression has not vanished. It has simply evolved. And at precisely this moment, when new forms of restriction emerge, the judiciary appears to be retreating. Alsup's face tightened. He insisted his comments were being taken out of context. Crockett replied calmly, "Then provide the context, Your Honour. Because from the perspective of millions of voters, it looks like the courts are stepping back from protecting their rights." A judge retreats. For the first time in memory, Judge Alsup seemed at a loss. He struck his gavel forcefully, announcing a 15-minute recess, before rising abruptly and leaving for his chambers. The gallery buzzed instantly, lawyers whispering, reporters firing off quick headlines. Observers exchanged stunned looks. The judge, known for smirks and dominance, had walked out mid-confrontation. Crockett, still at the podium, remained composed. Her aides offered quiet congratulations for holding her ground. She shook her head, eyes scanning her notes, as if reminding herself that this moment wasn't about personal victory. It was about something larger. Beyond one hearing. The dramatic clash had already made waves. For legal analysts, it raised profound questions about how far courts should defer to legislatures in the name of fraud prevention, when the evidence for actual fraud remained vanishingly small. For civil rights advocates, it symbolized something deeper, that challenges to systemic bias could come not only from grassroots activists, but also from elected officials willing to confront judicial authority directly. The courtroom was bracing for the second round. When Judge William Alsup re-entered after the brief recess, the smirk that once defined his demeanor had vanished. In its place was a hardened, icy resolve. This time, he appeared intent on reasserting his authority. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began sharply, "before the break, you made some rather bold claims about judicial bias. Let me remind you, respect for this court is not optional." Crockett met his gaze calmly. "I have the deepest respect for this institution, Your Honor. It is precisely because of that respect that I believe we must confront these critical issues openly." Alsup cut her off. "Then address the law, not attitudes." Turning to precedent. Without hesitation, Crockett pivoted. "Very well, Your Honor. Let's consider Crawford v. Marion County Election Board, where the Supreme Court upheld Indiana's voter ID law." At this, Alsup leaned forward, his expression easing into one of satisfaction. At last, she was moving into the terrain he trusted most: precedent. Crockett continued. "As this court knows, that decision rested on the state's ability to demonstrate a legitimate interest, while proving that the burden on voters was not severe. But," she paused, locking eyes with the judge, "the court was also clear that its ruling was specific to the facts of that case. The record before us today is profoundly different." She proceeded to dissect the current restrictions one by one, highlighting how they disproportionately burdened particular groups: minority voters, the elderly, and rural communities, with what she described as surgical precision. A battle of objections. Alsup interrupted repeatedly. "That's speculation, Congresswoman." Crockett countered without missing a beat. "On the contrary, Your Honor, these are statistical findings, gathered using methodologies previously accepted by this court." Again he pressed. "The state has presented its own evidence." Her reply was immediate. "Evidence that has been thoroughly rebutted by 3 independent experts, all testifying under oath." Every objection met with a precise rebuttal. Observers could sense the shift. The judge who once dominated every exchange was now forced onto the defensive, his authority challenged by Crockett's exhaustive preparation. The critical misstep. Then came the slip that altered the entire dynamic. Frustrated, Alsup said, "Perhaps in politics, Congresswoman, arguments about voter suppression win applause. But this is a court of law, not a campaign rally. I need you to stick to legal standards, not convenient narratives." The words landed like a thunderclap. The idea that disenfranchisement, the denial of voting rights, was merely a convenient narrative sent a visible jolt through the room. Civil rights attorneys stiffened. Reporters snapped their heads up from their notebooks. For the first time, Crockett looked momentarily shaken, but she quickly steadied herself, straightened her shoulders, and spoke in a voice that was quiet, yet unmistakably forceful. "Your Honor, did you just characterize the systematic exclusion of American citizens from their constitutional right to vote as a convenient narrative?" Holding the liner up, realizing his misstep, scrambled to clarify. "I was referring to the description of these verification procedures as suppression, a legal conclusion not yet determined." But Crockett refused to let the moment slip away. "With respect, Your Honor, you specifically dismissed concerns about disenfranchisement as emotional appeals and convenient narratives. That dismissal itself suggests a prejudgment about the merits of this case. And it raises a grave question. Can litigants fighting for voting rights truly expect fair consideration in this courtroom?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge that could not be ignored. For once, the balance of power seemed to tilt, not toward the bench, but toward the podium where Crockett stood. Why this exchange? Matters. This clash was more than a personal confrontation. It crystallized the broader tension in American democracy, where the concerns about disenfranchisement are treated as fundamental constitutional issues or brushed aside as political theatrics. By pressing the judge on his own language, Crockett forced into the open what many had long suspected: biases that too often remain unspoken in judicial proceedings. The courtroom froze. Judge William Allup's face turned crimson as he issued a threat rarely heard so directly. "Congresswoman Crockett, you are dangerously close to contempt of court." The air thickened with anticipation. Most expected Crockett to retreat. No one challenged a federal judge so brazenly, not inside his own courtroom. But instead of backing down, she reached into her briefcase and drew out a small, battered book. "Your Honor, I carry this pocket constitution with me everywhere." Holding it high for all to see, she read aloud. "The 15th Amendment states that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Lowering the booklet onto the podium, she declared, "This is not a convenient narrative. It is the text of our Constitution, and if defending that principle places me in contempt of this court, then I am prepared to accept that consequence." The silence that followed was electric. Attorneys and journalists alike would later describe it as one of the most dramatic moments ever witnessed in a federal courtroom. A judge-cornered Alsup sat motionless, his threat now hanging awkwardly between them. To press forward would have only confirmed Crockett's accusation of bias. At length, he relented, his voice less commanding than before. "Let us proceed with your legal arguments, Congresswoman." Observers could sense it. Crockett had landed the first decisive blow. The balance of power had shifted. What began as a routine hearing had evolved into a historic confrontation, with a Congresswoman's steady defiance putting a veteran judge on the defensive. But Alsup was not ready to surrender. As the afternoon session opened, he attempted to reassert his authority. "Congresswoman, you've made strong claims about the intent behind these voting measures. As you know, intent must be proven, not assumed." The bombshell evidence Crockett nodded as though she had anticipated this moment. "I'm glad you raised intent, Your Honor." She motioned to her aide, who stepped forward with a sealed folder. "These documents were obtained through discovery in a parallel state case. The confidentiality order was lifted just this morning, at 9:15. We have copies prepared for the court and opposing counsel." The room went silent as the folders were passed around. Inside, internal emails and planning notes from the very lawmakers who had authored the voting restrictions now under review. Judge Alsup frowned, visibly unsettled. "This court has not yet had the chance to review these materials." "That is correct, Your Honor," Crockett replied evenly. "But they are directly relevant to the very question you raised, the question of intent." The state's lead attorney shot to his feet. "We object, Your Honor. These documents were not included in the Congresswoman's brief." Crockett, calm as ever, responded, "They could not have been included. They were sealed at the time. But now they are public, and their relevance to this case cannot be denied." As the judge scanned the first pages, his expression tightened. State attorneys huddled urgently at their table, whispering in hushed tones. Everyone in the room understood. Something explosive was about to unfold. A turning point. "Congresswoman, what exactly are you alleging these documents show?" Alsup asked, his voice betraying unease. This was the moment Crockett had prepared for. With deliberate care, she began laying out the evidence. evidence that could shift the trajectory of the entire case. The packed courtroom, already charged with tension, seemed to hold its breath. Reporters leaned forward, pens suspended. What she revealed next had the potential not only to sway the ruling, but to redefine the national debate over voting rights. The room seemed to shift as Jasmine Crockett began unveiling the contents of the newly released documents. What they revealed was stunning. State legislators had not only discussed voting restrictions in abstract terms, but had openly described them as tools to preserve political control. One email bluntly stated, "If we can reduce turnout in these 5 urban districts by just 3%, we maintain control indefinitely." Another message referred to historically black colleges and universities as opposition voter factories, with lawmakers strategizing to invalidate student IDs for voting while keeping gun licenses acceptable. Exposing the strategy step by step, Crockett walked the court through the emails. Each one revealed calculations based not on policy, but on race, age, and income. The legislators had dissected voting habits and deliberately designed measures to suppress turnout among minority and student populations. The effect in the courtroom was immediate. Reporters typed furiously, racing to capture every word. Civil rights attorneys exchanged glances that mixed vindication with outrage. The state's legal team looked increasingly cornered, whispering urgently at their table. Even Judge Allup's demeanor had changed. Gone was the dismissive smirk that had dominated the morning session. In its place was something far more serious: concern, perhaps even unease, authentication, and impact. Sensing the shift, Alsup asked the obvious question. "These documents, have they been authenticated?" Crockett was ready. "Yes, Your Honor. A state court confirmed their authenticity this morning. The metadata and electronic signatures are intact. These files came directly from legislators' official accounts." But her most powerful point was yet to come. Holding up a final email, she read, "Frame everything around election security. Never mention demographic impacts in writing. Remember, we need neutral justifications for the courts." The impact was explosive. This wasn't merely evidence of discriminatory intent. It was proof of a deliberate plan to disguise that intent, a calculated effort to mislead the very courts tasked with protecting constitutional rights. Turning the judge's words back on him, Crockett then delivered the blow that tied everything together. "Your Honor, earlier today, you described concerns about voter disenfranchisement as emotional appeals and convenient narratives. These documents prove why such judicial skepticism is dangerous. These legislators counted on it. They knew that if they offered a neutral pretext, many courts would dismiss the deeper reality. They were banking on judges to look away." Her words hung heavy in the chamber. For the first time, it wasn't just the legislators on trial. It was the culture of judicial doubt itself, a culture that Allup's own earlier remarks had reflected. The defense crumbles. The state's attorneys scrambled to respond. They insisted the emails were taken out of context, that they reflected only the views of a handful of lawmakers, not the entire legislative body. But the arguments rang hollow against the plain language of the documents. When they claimed demographic challenges could apply to any group, Crockett calmly directed them to another email, this one explicitly listing AA turnout as a problem to be solved. Each rebuttal deepened the impression that the legislators had acted with precision and purpose. The defense's denials only underscored the strength of the evidence. A case transformed. By late afternoon, it was clear to everyone in the room this was no longer the same case that had opened that morning. What had begun as a contest of legal theory had become a reckoning with hard evidence of intentional voter suppression, and at the centre of it all stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who had shifted the balance of the courtroom and forced one of the nation's most formidable judges to confront uncomfortable truths. The confrontation had started as a long shot, a lone congresswoman challenging restrictive voting laws in a courtroom ruled by a skeptical judge. By the end of the day, it had become something far greater, an exposé of intentional voter suppression and the judicial blind spots that had allowed it to flourish. Then came the moment that stunned everyone present. Judge William Alsup, still holding the stack of damning emails, raised his hand for silence. The chatter instantly ceased. His voice, when he spoke, was nothing like the dismissive tone that had defined the morning. Congresswoman Crockett, when you began today, I doubted your arguments, he admitted slowly. I believed you were bringing political theatre into this courtroom. I suspected your concerns about voter suppression were overstated. He paused, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose, the gesture conveying a weariness rarely seen from the bench. These documents suggest I was wrong. A judge's rare admission. A collective gasp rippled across the courtroom. Federal judges almost never acknowledge error publicly, least of all in the middle of proceedings. Yet Alsup pressed on. The evidence you have presented demonstrates not only discriminatory intent, but also a deliberate attempt to conceal that intent under the guise of neutrality, he said, his tone now steady but sombre. This court has a constitutional duty to safeguard the right to vote, especially when confronted with such evidence. Turning directly toward Crockett, the smirk that had once seemed permanent was gone. Congresswoman, I owe you an apology for my earlier remarks. You were not being emotional or political. You were fulfilling your role as an advocate for constitutional rights, and that is precisely what this system depends upon. The room erupted in hushed murmurs. Crockett, outwardly composed, simply nodded. Thank you, Your Honour. The right to vote is not partisan. It is the foundation of our democracy. When we defend that right, we defend the Constitution itself. Legal observers in the gallery exchanged glances. They knew they had just witnessed history. From courtroom drama to national story. By the time Crockett returned to her seat, the narrative had shifted entirely. What began as a routine hearing had transformed into a landmark moment. A federal judge publicly reversing course, and a congresswoman reshaping the future of voting rights litigation through preparation, conviction, and unflinching resolve. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, hashtags such as Jasmine Crockett'S blow were trending nationwide. Legal analysts called it one of the most significant courtroom confrontations on voting rights since the Voting Rights Act challenges of the 1960s. CNN's legal desk described the showdown as a watershed moment. MSNBC aired a primetime special titled How Congresswoman Crockett Changed the Game. Even Fox News, though framing the story differently, acknowledged the unprecedented nature of a sitting federal judge apologizing from the bench. The nation reacts. By evening, the very emails that Crockett had unveiled were circulating across major outlets, redacted only to remove sensitive details. The bluntness of the language shocked many Americans. One message in particular captured national attention. A legislator bluntly writing, "These communities only started voting in the last few elections." The words were a chilling reminder that efforts to suppress votes were not relics of the past, but deliberate strategies unfolding in the present. A moment that echoes. Beyond the courtroom. What had unfolded that day would not end with one case or one ruling. It had cracked open a larger debate about judicial responsibility, legislative intent, and the fragile state of American democracy. And for Jasmine Crockett, it marked a transformation. From a congresswoman dismissed as too political in the morning, to a constitutional advocate who had forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths by the evening. If they can't handle a little extra paperwork, maybe they're not committed enough to deserve a ballot. That line, taken directly from one of the leaked emails, spread like wildfire across television screens and social media feeds. To many Americans, it sounded like confirmation of what voting rights advocates had long suspected. These restrictions weren't about protecting elections, but about keeping certain people from the polls. The reaction was swift and overwhelming. Civil rights organizations announced new lawsuits, almost immediately, using Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett'S strategy as a model. Legal scholars published commentary within days, describing her courtroom approach as a turning point for future litigation. Several law schools even announced plans to include the hearing transcript in their civil rights curricula, ensuring students would study it for years to come. Shifting national strategy. Inside the White House, senior advisors scrambled to adjust their own playbook. "This changes our entire voting rights strategy," one aide told the Washington Post. Crockett, they argued, had provided a clear roadmap for exposing the true motivations behind restrictive laws. Judge William Alsup also felt the reverberations. His admission of error in open court had already shocked observers, but the consequences didn't stop there. 3 days later, he issued a sweeping preliminary injunction, halting the contested voting restrictions until a full trial could be held. His 87-page opinion drew heavily from the very emails Crockett had introduced. The documents, he wrote, revealed a clear pattern of intentional discrimination cloaked in pretextual appeals to election security. Most strikingly, Alsup used his written decision to acknowledge his own earlier misjudgment. Judicial skepticism toward discrimination claims can itself become an unintended barrier to equal justice. When courts begin from disbelief, we risk enabling precisely the kind of deception attempted in this case. Legal experts called the statement groundbreaking. Harvard's Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "Judge Allup's admission may be as important as his ruling. He's acknowledging that judicial attitudes themselves can perpetuate injustice." A new role for Crockett. For Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath was both rewarding and demanding. She became an overnight hero to voting rights advocates. Civil rights groups invited her to advise on similar cases nationwide. Law schools asked her to lecture on her method of constitutional advocacy. In a CNN interview a week later, Crockett downplayed her personal role and emphasized the broader stakes. "This wasn't about me or Judge Alsup. It was about whether our courts are willing to recognize what's happening to voting rights in America. For too long, judges have given the benefit of the doubt to laws that clearly target minority voters. That day, we pulled back the curtain." When asked if she had felt intimidated by Allup's dismissive tone early in the hearing, Crockett smiled. "I've faced skeptical judges my entire career. As a black woman attorney in Texas, I knew I'd have to be twice as prepared and twice as persuasive. But I also knew this: the facts and the Constitution are powerful weapons when you wield them correctly." Political fallout. The fallout extended far beyond the courtroom. The state legislators exposed in the emails faced intense public pressure. 2 resigned within weeks. Others suddenly found themselves challenged in their own primaries. The governor, eager to distance himself from the scandal, announced a comprehensive review of the state's election procedures. And the ripple effect spread nationally. Lawmakers in at least 3 other states quickly withdrew proposed bills that mirrored the contested restrictions, wary of drawing the same kind of firestorm. The legacy of a moment. What began as a tense exchange between a skeptical judge and a determined congresswoman had grown into something historic, a reckoning that reshaped both legal doctrine and political reality. It was a reminder that in the fight for democracy, one well-prepared advocate can expose truths powerful enough to change the national conversation. Nobody wants to end up in the headlines over leaked emails, a state legislator confided to the New York Times, summing up the mood after the explosive revelations. What began as a single confrontation in a Washington courtroom had expanded into a national reckoning, not just about one state's voting restrictions, but about how the judiciary itself approaches claims of voter suppression. A legal and cultural shift. In the months that followed, the ripple effects were unmistakable. Law journals dedicated entire editions to dissecting the case, tracing how skepticism from the bench had shaped voting rights law since Shelby County versus Holder. Bar associations across the country began hosting workshops on unconscious bias in judicial decision-making. 6 months on, a survey of federal court rulings revealed something unprecedented. Voting rights lawsuits were succeeding more often. Analysts credited what they began calling the Crockett effect, a new willingness by judges to probe beneath states' claims of election security and test whether those justifications masked discriminatory intent. Meanwhile, law schools incorporated the hearing transcript into their syllabi. Professors emphasized how Jasmine Crockett had fused exacting preparation with moral conviction to expose the gap between neutral-sounding policies and racially targeted outcomes. As Yale's Heather Gerken wrote, "She didn't simply win an argument, she altered how judges think about these cases by showing how discrimination hides behind polite legal language." The human dimension. For communities most at risk, the case had immediate consequences. Grassroots groups in the affected districts held rallies of gratitude. Seniors wrote heartfelt letters to Crockett, explaining how the blocked restrictions would have shut them out of the voting booth. The victory was not abstract. It safeguarded their voices. From skepticism to respect. A year later, Crockett once again stood in Judge William Allup's courtroom, this time for the final ruling. The atmosphere could not have been more different. The man who had once dismissed her with a smirk now addressed her with unmistakable respect. In a sweeping decision, Alsup permanently struck down the restrictions. He went even further, ordering the state to submit any future election law changes for federal oversight, a restoration of protections gutted by Shelby County. Commentators called the judgment historic, warning of inevitable appeals, but predicting it could set the standard for voting rights law for decades to come. Words that will be remembered. Allup's opinion concluded with language destined for history books. The right to vote preserves all other rights. When barriers are imposed deliberately, courts have a duty to act, not as political participants, but as guardians of constitutional guarantees. This court began with misplaced skepticism towards suppression claims. That error was corrected through evidence and exceptional advocacy, reminding us that judges must not assume discrimination is absent, but remain alert to its presence whenever it emerges. Crockett's final response? After the ruling, reporters crowded around Crockett. Did she feel vindicated? "This was never about me," she answered. "It was about protecting the Constitution and the millions of Americans who stood to lose their voice." Judge Alsup showed true courage by correcting his mistake and following the evidence. That is what justice requires. One journalist pressed further. How did it feel to silence a judge who once mocked her arguments? Crockett smiled faintly. "I didn't silence Judge Alsup. The facts did. The documents did. The Constitution did. My role was simply to make sure they were heard." Observers noted that her words captured the very strategy that had made her so effective. She never allowed the battle to become personal. She focused relentlessly on the principles and the record before the court, transforming skepticism into accountability and a confrontation into a constitutional milestone. The clash between Jasmine Crockett and Judge William Alsup would be remembered not merely as a fiery exchange in a courtroom, but as a turning point in the national fight over the ballot box. It proved that, when lawyers come armed with rigorous preparation and unshakable resolve, even the most entrenched judicial skepticism can be overcome. More than anything, the confrontation reinforced a timeless truth. voting is not a settled right to be taken for granted. It is the cornerstone of democracy, and it demands constant defense. Crockett's own words. Speaking. Months later, before the Congressional Black Caucus, Crockett framed the moment within a longer struggle. The fight for the ballot did not end with the 15th Amendment. It did not end with the Voting Rights Act. It is waged every single day in every courtroom where attempts to restrict participation are tested. And as long as there are efforts to silence voters, there must be those of us prepared to answer. Her words echoed the reality that the confrontation had exposed. Progress was fragile, and vigilance was essential. The larger question. America now faced an uncertain path. Would other judges show the same intellectual honesty that Alsup ultimately displayed, willing to reverse themselves when confronted with undeniable evidence? Or would skepticism and deference to legislatures remain the default posture, allowing discrimination to persist behind claims of neutrality? The answer, many believed, would shape the character of American democracy for decades to come. A shift in judicial culture. One thing, however, was undeniable. The era of dismissing claims of voter suppression with a smirk had ended. Crockett had shattered that posture in open court, proving that evidence, persistence, and constitutional principle could compel even the most reluctant jurists to take a harder look. As similar lawsuits advanced in other states, her confrontation stood as both a model and a warning. Courts could no longer ignore the reality of targeted restrictions without facing public scrutiny and historical judgment. A fight without end. The battle over the ballot remains among America's most pressing and enduring struggles. Crockett's victory was not the end of the story. It was a chapter in an ongoing saga that continues to unfold in courthouses across the nation.